At 9:55 p.m. on August 21, 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian stood alone in the Omega Site laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, stacking tungsten carbide bricks around a spherical plutonium core the size of a softball. The core weighed 14 pounds, 6.2 kilograms of plutonium-239, enough fissile material to build an atomic bomb. Daghlian was conducting a criticality experiment, measuring how close the plutonium could get to achieving a sustained nuclear chain reaction without actually exploding. The tungsten carbide bricks acted as neutron reflectors. Each brick he added pushed the plutonium closer to criticality. The procedure required extreme precision. Add bricks too slowly and you gathered no useful data. Add them too quickly and the core went critical. If the core went critical, it would release a massive burst of radiation. Anyone standing nearby would receive a lethal dose in seconds. Daghlian had performed this experiment 17 times over the past 3 months. He knew the procedure perfectly. Stack bricks in a cube formation around the core. Monitor the neutron counter. When the counter reading approached the critical threshold, stop adding bricks. Measure the configuration. Record data. Remove bricks carefully. End experiment. Simple, safe, routine. Except tonight, Daghlian was working alone. This violated safety protocols. Los Alamos regulations required a minimum of 2 personnel present during criticality experiments. 1 person to handle the materials, 1 person to monitor instruments and abort the experiment if necessary. Daghlian had requested permission to work alone. His supervisor had denied the request. Daghlian came to the lab anyway. Why? Because Daghlian was 24 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and convinced he understood nuclear physics better than the safety regulations did. He'd graduated from Purdue University at age 19 with degrees in physics and mathematics. He'd joined the Manhattan Project in 1944. He'd worked on the Trinity test, the world's first nuclear detonation. He'd seen an atomic bomb explode. After witnessing that, stacking some bricks around a plutonium core seemed trivial. At 9:58 p.m., Daghlian placed the 29th brick. The neutron counter reading jumped. He checked the gauge. Still below critical threshold, but close. Very close. He'd 1 more brick to complete the cube formation, 1 more measurement, then he'd have the data he needed. He reached for the 30th brick. It weighed 8.4 pounds, a rectangular block of tungsten carbide measuring 4 inches by 6 inches by 2 inches. He lifted it carefully, moved it toward the gap in the brick formation. His hand was 12 inches above the plutonium core. The neutron counter reading climbed, 10 inches. The reading climbed faster, 8 inches. Even faster. At 6 inches, Daghlian realized his mistake. He was too close. The brick was too close. If he placed it, the core would go critical. He needed to abort. Pull the brick back. Stop the experiment. He started to withdraw the brick. His hand slipped. The tungsten carbide block fell. It struck the edge of the brick stack, bounced, and landed directly on top of the plutonium core. The neutron counter exploded. The reading went from 85% of critical threshold to 125% in 0.3 seconds. The plutonium core achieved supercriticality. Nuclear fission began. Plutonium atoms split. Neutrons radiated outward in a spherical wave traveling at 12,000 miles per second. The neutrons hit other plutonium atoms. Those atoms split. More neutrons, more fission, exponential multiplication. Daghlian saw a blue flash. Cherenkov radiation. Charged particles moving through air faster than the speed of light in that medium. The glow meant one thing: massive radiation release. He was standing 18 inches from an unshielded critical nuclear mass. He was absorbing thousands of rems of radiation per second. A lethal dose was 600 rems. Daghlian had already absorbed more than that in the first 2 seconds. But his brain didn't process death. His brain processed problem solving. Stop the reaction. End the criticality. He reached toward the pile. His right hand touched the tungsten carbide brick that had fallen on the core. The brick was hot, approximately 200 degrees from absorbing radiation. Daghlian grabbed it anyway. His skin blistered instantly. He yanked the brick off the core and threw it across the room. The neutron counter reading dropped immediately. The core fell below critical threshold. The chain reaction stopped. The blue glow faded. The entire criticality event had lasted 4.5 seconds. Daghlian had just absorbed approximately 510 rem of radiation, more than enough to kill him, but not instantly. Acute radiation syndrome doesn't kill immediately. It kills slowly, painfully, inevitably over days or weeks. Daghlian stood in the laboratory for approximately 15 seconds. He felt no pain yet. Radiation doesn't hurt when it hits you. There's no sensation. Your cells are being destroyed at the molecular level, but your nerves don't register damage until later, much later. To the telephone on the laboratory wall and called the base medical facility. "This is Harry Daghlian at Omega Site. I've had a radiation accident. Send medical personnel immediately." Then he sat down on the floor and waited. His right hand was already swelling. The skin where he'd touched the hot brick was charred black, but that was thermal burn, not radiation. The radiation damage was invisible, happening inside his cells, inside his DNA, breaking molecular bonds, destroying his ability to produce new blood cells, new skin cells, new intestinal lining cells, everything that kept him alive. Want to see what 510 rem of radiation does to a human body? Hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Daghlian. The medical team arrived at 10:18 p.m., 20 minutes after the accident. They found Daghlian conscious, coherent, able to walk. He explained what had happened, how the brick had fallen, how he'd removed it, how long the core had been critical. The doctors examined him. His vital signs were normal. Heart rate 72 beats per minute, blood pressure 120/80, respiration normal, temperature 98.6 degrees. He showed no immediate symptoms of radiation exposure except the thermal burn on his right hand. The doctors knew this meant nothing. Acute radiation syndrome follows a predictable progression. Phase 1, prodromal phase, 24-48 hours after exposure, nausea, vomiting, fatigue. Phase 2, latent phase, lasting several days. The victim feels better, symptoms disappear. This is false hope. The body is dying, but the damage hasn't manifested yet. Phase 3, manifest illness phase. The symptoms return with devastating intensity. Blood cell counts collapse. The immune system fails. Internal bleeding begins. Phase 4, death or recovery. At doses above 400 rem, recovery is unlikely. At 510 rem, recovery is impossible. Daghlian was transported to the Los Alamos Medical Center. Dr. Louis Hempelman, the chief medical officer, oversaw his care. Hempelman had treated radiation casualties before. He knew what was coming. He also knew there was no cure. Radiation damage to bone marrow was irreversible. Once the bone marrow stopped producing blood cells, the patient would die. The only question was how long it would take. Blood samples were drawn every 4 hours. Initially, Daghlian's blood counts were normal. White blood cells, 7,200 per microliter. Red blood cells, 4.8 million per microliter. Platelets, 250,000 per microliter, all within normal ranges. On August 22nd, 18 hours after exposure, Daghlian developed nausea. He vomited 3 times. The prodromal phase had begun. His white blood cell count had dropped to 5,800, still technically normal, but declining. On August 23rd, the nausea intensified. Daghlian couldn't eat. He vomited everything he attempted to consume. His white blood cell count fell to 2,400, below normal. The radiation had destroyed his body's ability to produce new white blood cells. The existing cells would continue dying at their normal rate. Within a week, he would have almost none left. On August 24th, Daghlian felt better. The nausea subsided. He was able to eat. His energy returned. He asked when he could return to work. This was the latent phase, the false hope. His white blood cell count was 1,200, dangerously low. His immune system was collapsing. But he felt fine. Dr. Hempelman explained that feeling better didn't mean getting better. The radiation damage was permanent. The bone marrow was destroyed. Blood cell production had stopped. In approximately 1 week, when his existing blood cells died naturally, his counts would drop to near zero. Then the manifest illness phase would begin. Daghlian didn't believe this. He felt healthy. He was young, strong. His body would recover. Human bodies were resilient. Dr. Hempelman didn't argue. There was no point. Daghlian would learn the truth soon enough. On August 27th, 6 days after exposure, the manifest illness phase began. Daghlian developed fever, 101.5 degrees Celsius. His white blood cell count was 300. His immune system could no longer fight infections. Any bacteria in his environment could kill him. The medical staff moved him to an isolation room. Sterile environment. No visitors except medical personnel wearing protective equipment. They started him on antibiotics even though he had no diagnosed infection. With his immune system destroyed, infection was inevitable. On August 28th, his gums started bleeding. His white blood cell count was 180. His platelet count had fallen to 45,000. Platelets are essential for blood clotting. When platelet counts drop below 50,000, spontaneous bleeding begins. Small capillaries rupture, blood leaks into tissues. On August 29th, Daghlian developed petechiae, small red spots covering his arms and torso. Each spot was a tiny hemorrhage where capillaries had burst under his skin. His platelet count was 28,000. On August 30th, he began coughing blood, internal bleeding in his lungs. His platelet count was 15,000. The doctors considered blood transfusions, but transfusions only provided temporary relief. The transfused platelets would function for maybe 72 hours. Then they'd die. His bone marrow couldn't produce replacements. Eventually, they'd run out of blood to transfuse. The outcome was inevitable. On September 1st, 11 days after exposure, Daghlian's right hand developed gangrene, the hand he'd used to remove the tungsten carbide brick. The thermal burn had prevented proper healing. The radiation damage had destroyed his body's ability to fight infection. Bacteria had colonized the dead tissue. The infection was spreading. Dr. Hempelmann recommended amputation, remove the infected hand before sepsis killed him. Daghlian refused. He said if he was going to die, he wanted to die intact. Hempelmann didn't press the issue. Amputation would only extend Daghlian's life by a few days at most. It wouldn't save him. On September 3rd, Daghlian lost consciousness. Septic shock. The bacterial infection from his hand had entered his bloodstream. His blood pressure dropped to 70/40. His heart rate increased to 140 beats per minute. His kidneys began failing. The medical staff administered IV fluids and vasopressor medications to maintain blood pressure. They knew it was futile. Daghlian's immune system was gone. His bone marrow was destroyed. His body had no way to fight the infection. On September 10th, Daghlian developed hemorrhagic diarrhea. The lining of his intestines was sloughing off. Without the ability to produce new intestinal cells, the intestinal wall was degrading. He was essentially bleeding to death internally. On September 12th, his kidneys failed completely. No urine output. Toxins accumulated in his blood. Uremia set in. He became delirious, unable to recognize people. On September 15th, 25 days after the accident, Harry Daghlian died. Cause of death: acute radiation syndrome. Organ failure, sepsis. Internal hemorrhaging. He was 24 years old. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Hempelmann and a team of pathologists from the Manhattan Project. They documented everything. Bone marrow, completely necrotic, no viable cells remaining. Intestinal lining, 90% destroyed. Lungs, extensive hemorrhaging. Liver, necrotic lesions throughout. The right hand, complete gangrenous destruction extending to the wrist. The plutonium core that had killed Daghlian was cleaned, repackaged, and returned to storage. Los Alamos Command ordered a comprehensive review of criticality experiment protocols. New safety regulations were implemented. No solo experiments, minimum 2-person teams, additional shielding required, remote handling tools mandatory, but the plutonium core remained. It was valuable. Weapons-grade plutonium was expensive and difficult to produce. The core would be used for future experiments, carefully, safely, with proper protocols. The core was nicknamed the Demon Core by Los Alamos physicists, the sphere that had killed Harry Daghlian. 9 months later, it would kill again. On May 21, 1946, physicist Louis Slotin was conducting a criticality experiment with the same plutonium core in the same laboratory. Slotin was demonstrating the experiment to 7 other scientists. He was using a technique called tickling the dragon's tail. 2 beryllium hemispheres, each weighing 8 pounds. When placed around the plutonium core, the beryllium reflected neutrons back into the core, driving it toward criticality. Slotin held the upper hemisphere with his left hand. He used a screwdriver in his right hand to maintain a tiny gap between the hemispheres. If the gap closed, the core would go critical. The screwdriver was the only thing preventing that. At 3:20 p.m., the screwdriver slipped. The hemispheres snapped together. The core went critical. A blue flash filled the room. Slotin immediately knocked the upper hemisphere away with his bare hand, ending the reaction. The criticality lasted less than 1 second. But that was enough. Slotin had absorbed approximately 2,100 rem of radiation, 4 times the dose that killed Daghlian. The 7 observers had absorbed between 50 and 160 rem each, non-lethal doses but significant. Slotin turned to the others and said, "You'll all be fine, but I'm dead." He was right. Louis Alexander Slotin was 35 years old when he tickled the dragon's tail for the last time. Born in Winnipeg, Canada, to Jewish immigrant parents, He'd earned his doctorate in physical chemistry from King's College London in 1936. He joined the Manhattan Project in 1944, recruited specifically for his expertise in handling dangerous materials. Slotin had nerves of steel. While other scientists used remote handling tools and extensive shielding, Slotin preferred direct manipulation, hands-on work. He believed you couldn't truly understand nuclear physics without feeling the materials, sensing the reactions, developing intuitive relationship with the processes. This philosophy had made him the Manhattan Project's premier assembly technician. When the first atomic bomb cores needed to be assembled at Trinity Site in July 1945, Slotin did the work personally. When the Fat Man plutonium bomb was prepared for deployment against Nagasaki in August 1945, Slotin assembled that core too. He'd handled more weapons-grade fissile material than any human being alive. He'd performed criticality experiments with plutonium cores 49 times. He'd tickled the dragon's tail 49 times and walked away unharmed every time. His colleagues called him the most reckless physicist at Los Alamos. Enrico Fermi, Nobel laureate and Manhattan Project leader, had watched Slotin perform the screwdriver technique once. Fermi had said, "You will be dead within a year if you continue that." Slotin had laughed it off. Richard Feynman, another brilliant Manhattan Project physicist, had refused to be in the same room when Slotin performed criticality experiments. "That man is going to kill himself and everyone near him," Feynman had said. But Slotin was confident. He'd performed the experiment 49 times without incident. He knew exactly how far he could push the system. He understood the physics perfectly. The screwdriver technique was safe if you had steady hands and perfect focus. Slotin had both. On May 21, 1946, Slotin was scheduled to leave Los Alamos. His work on the Manhattan Project was complete. He was returning to the University of Chicago to resume academic research. This would be his last experiment, his final demonstration. He wanted to show the technique to the scientists who would replace him. 7 men attended the demonstration in the Omega Site laboratory. Raymer Schreiber, scientist; Alvin Graves, scientist; Alan Kemmerer, scientist; Theodore Perlman, scientist; Dwight Young, military security officer; Marion Cieslicki, military security officer; Samuel Allen, laboratory technician. Slotin positioned everyone carefully. Schreiber stood directly behind Slotin, approximately 3 feet away. The others stood farther back, between 5 and 12 feet from the experiment table. Slotin explained the procedure as he worked. The plutonium core is subcritical when isolated. Adding the beryllium hemispheres creates neutron reflection. The reflected neutrons increase the fission rate inside the core. As the hemispheres close, the reflection becomes more efficient. When the gap reaches approximately 0.2 millimeters, the core achieves criticality. My job is to maintain a gap slightly larger than that threshold. This allows us to measure the approach to criticality without actually achieving it. He placed the lower beryllium hemisphere on the table. A perfect half-sphere, machined to precise tolerances, with a spherical cavity in the center sized to hold the plutonium core. He set the demon core into the cavity. The plutonium sat nested in beryllium, gleaming silver under the laboratory lights. Then Slotin picked up the upper beryllium hemisphere with his left hand. He held a flat blade screwdriver in his right hand. "I'll lower the upper hemisphere until the gap is approximately 1 millimeter. At that distance, the neutron counter will show approximately 70% of critical activity. Then I'll demonstrate how sensitive the system is by varying the gap slightly." He lowered the upper hemisphere slowly. The gap between the two halves closed. 3 millimeters, 2 millimeters, 1 millimeter. He inserted the screwdriver blade into the gap, using it to prevent the hemispheres from touching. The neutron counter reading climbed. 50% of critical, 60%, 65%, 70% perfect. "Notice the counter response," Slotin said. "The relationship between gap distance and neutron multiplication is exponential. Small changes in gap distance create large changes in activity. For example," he adjusted the screwdriver angle slightly, reducing the gap by approximately 0.1 millimeters. The neutron counter jumped to 78%. He increased the gap. The counter dropped to 63%. He was demonstrating control, showing the observers how precisely he could manipulate the system. Then his hand cramped. A muscle spasm in his right thumb, completely involuntary. His grip on the screwdriver loosened for exactly 0.4 seconds. The screwdriver rotated. The blade slipped out of the gap. The upper beryllium hemisphere dropped onto the lower hemisphere with a soft metallic click. The neutron counter exploded. The reading went from 70% to 320% in less than 1 second. The demon core achieved supercriticality. Nuclear chain reaction initiated. Plutonium atoms split by the billions. Neutrons flooded outward. The room filled with a brilliant blue flash. Cherenkov radiation. The air itself was glowing. Slotin saw the flash. He understood instantly what had happened. His first thought was not panic. It was calculation. How long had the hemispheres been closed? Approximately 0.6 seconds so far. Every additional tenth of a second meant exponentially more radiation exposure for himself and everyone in the room. He had to stop the reaction immediately. He didn't use tools. He didn't grab the screwdriver. He used his bare right hand. He flicked the upper beryllium hemisphere off the assembly. The hemisphere flew across the table, hit the floor, and rolled away. The neutron counter reading dropped instantly. The core fell subcritical. The blue glow faded. Total criticality duration, 0.9 seconds, less than 1 second, but long enough to deliver lethal doses to everyone in the room. The radiation had radiated spherically from the core. Inverse square law meant intensity decreased with distance. Slotin, standing 16 inches from the core, had absorbed the most. Schreiber, standing 3 feet away directly behind Slotin, had absorbed the second highest dose. The others farther away had absorbed progressively less. Want to see what 2100 rem does to a human body in 9 days? Hit that like button. And subscribe. Back to Slotin. The room was silent. 7 men stared at Slotin. Slotin stared at his right hand, the hand that had touched the beryllium hemisphere, the hand that had been 14 inches from a critical nuclear mass for 0.9 seconds. His skin looked normal. No burns, no marks, but he knew that meant nothing. Radiation damage was invisible. He turned to the others. His voice was calm, controlled. We need to document our positions. Radiation exposure is proportional to distance from the core. I need each of you to mark exactly where you were standing when the criticality occurred. We'll use those positions to calculate individual doses. The men didn't move. They were processing what had just happened. They'd witnessed a nuclear chain reaction, unshielded, at room temperature, in an occupied laboratory. Some of them understood the implications immediately. Others were still confused. Schreiber asked, "How much exposure did we receive?" Slotin did the calculation in his head. Distance from core, duration of criticality, estimated neutron flux. I absorbed approximately 2000 rem, maybe more. You absorbed approximately 160 rem. The others absorbed between 50 and 100 rem depending on distance and shielding from my body. Schreiber understood radiation doses. He knew that 600 rem was considered lethal. Louis, you're... Yes, I'm dead, Slotin said. But you'll survive. 160 rem is serious but survivable. The others will be fine. Maybe some nausea in the next few days, but no permanent damage. He walked to the telephone and called the medical facility. This is Louis Slotin at Omega Site. We've had a criticality accident. 7 personnel exposed. Send medical teams immediately. I'll need isolation facilities prepared. Then he turned back to the observers. Mark your positions now. Use chalk. Draw outlines of your feet on the floor. We'll need this data for the investigation. The men marked their positions. Slotin supervised, making sure they documented everything accurately. He was already thinking like a scientist, not a dying man. This accident would provide valuable data about radiation exposure at various distances. The information could improve safety protocols. It could save lives in the future, even if it couldn't save his. The medical teams arrived at 3:35 p.m., 15 minutes after the accident. They found Slotin standing calmly at the experiment table, explaining to the observers how the dose calculations would be performed. Dr. Louis Hempelmann, the same physician who treated Harry Daghlian 9 months earlier, examined Slotin. Louis, how are you feeling? Fine. No symptoms yet, but I absorbed approximately 2,100 remen. Prodromal phase should begin in 12 to 18 hours. Hempelmann had known Slotin for 3 years. They'd worked together on radiation safety protocols. They'd discussed the effects of acute radiation syndrome extensively. Slotin knew exactly what was coming. He knew every phase, every symptom, every stage of deterioration. And he knew there was no treatment. We'll transport you to the hospital, Hempelmann said. Make you comfortable. I don't need to be comfortable. I need to document this. Take blood samples every 2 hours. Monitor cell counts continuously. Record all symptoms. This is the highest acute dose any human has survived long enough to study. We can learn from this. Slotin was transported to Los Alamos Medical Center at 4:00 p.m. The other 7 observers were examined and released. All showed normal vital signs. Blood samples were drawn for baseline measurements. They were instructed to report any symptoms immediately. Slotin was placed in the same isolation room where Daghlian had died. The room had been sterilized, but the equipment was identical. The bed, the monitors, the IV stands. Slotin recognized everything. He knew how this would end. Initial blood work showed normal counts. White blood cells, 7,400 per microliter. Red blood cells, 5.1 million per microliter. Platelets, 265,000 per microliter. Dr. Hempelmann knew these numbers would collapse within days. At 2:00 a.m. on May 22nd, 10 hours after exposure, Slotin developed nausea. He vomited twice. The prodromal phase had begun. Earlier than expected, the dose must have been even higher than 2,100 rem, possibly 20,500 rem. Hempelmann didn't tell Slotin this. There was no point. Higher dose just meant faster death. The outcome was the same. By 8:00 a.m., Slotin had vomited 14 times. He couldn't keep water down. His white blood cell count had dropped to 3,200. The radiation had destroyed his bone marrow's ability to produce new cells. Existing cells would continue dying on their normal schedules. Within 72 hours, his immune system would be gone. On May 23rd, 36 hours after exposure, Slotin felt better. The nausea stopped. He was able to eat. The latent phase, false hope. His white blood cell count was 1,800, dropping steadily. He used this time to write. He documented everything: his exact position during the accident, his hand placement, the screwdriver angle, the duration of criticality. He sketched diagrams showing the experiment setup. He calculated neutron flux based on the neutron counter readings. He wrote detailed descriptions of his symptoms, timing each onset precisely. Dr. Hempelmann read these notes. They were scientifically rigorous, perfectly documented. Slotin was dying, but his mind was functioning with absolute clarity. He was conducting the final experiment of his career, himself as the test subject. On May 25th, 4 days after exposure, the manifest illness phase began. Slotin's white blood cell count dropped to 400. His lymph nodes swelled. His fever spiked to 102.8 degrees. Infections were beginning. His destroyed immune system couldn't fight them. On May 26th, his right hand began blistering. The hand he'd used to knock the beryllium hemisphere away. The hand that had been closest to the core. Radiation had destroyed the skin cell's ability to regenerate. The outer layers were dying. Underneath, there were no new cells to replace them. By May 27th, the blisters covered his entire right hand and extended halfway up his forearm. The skin was turning black. Necrosis. Dead tissue. His white blood cell count was 180. Sepsis was inevitable. On May 28th, he developed petechiae, the tiny red spots Harry Daghlian had developed, spontaneous hemorrhaging from failed platelets. Slotin's platelet count was 32,000, dropping 5,000 per day. On May 29th, he began experiencing severe abdominal pain. His intestinal lining was breaking down. The cells that lined his digestive tract normally replaced themselves every 3 to 5 days. With his bone marrow destroyed, no replacement cells were being produced. The intestinal wall was degrading. He started passing blood, hemorrhagic diarrhea, internal bleeding. Dr. Hempelmann started blood transfusions, type O negative, universal donor. The transfused blood would function temporarily, but Slotin's body couldn't maintain it. On May 30th, 9 days after the accident, Louis Slotin died at 11:00 a.m. Cause of death: acute radiation syndrome with massive internal hemorrhaging, complete bone marrow failure, and systemic sepsis. He was 35 years old. His last words, spoken to Dr. Hempelmann at 10:47 a.m., were, "I hope the data I provided helps prevent this from happening to others." The autopsy showed complete destruction of all rapidly dividing cell populations. Bone marrow, 100% necrotic. Intestinal lining, completely absent. Skin, massive necrosis extending from his right hand to his shoulder. His internal organs had hemorrhaged extensively. Bolum 3. The 7 observers who'd witnessed Slotin's accident were monitored closely for weeks. Raymer Schreiber, who'd absorbed the highest dose at approximately 160 rem, developed symptoms within 48 hours. Nausea, fatigue, hair loss. His white blood cell count dropped to 2,800, then recovered slowly over 3 weeks. He survived with no permanent damage. The radiation dose, while serious, had been below the lethal threshold. Alvin Graves absorbed approximately 90 rem. He developed mild radiation sickness, nausea for 1 week, temporary hair thinning, full recovery within a month. The other 5 observers absorbed between 50 and 85 rem each. All experienced minor symptoms, all recovered completely, but the psychological damage was permanent. They'd watched a man die in slow motion. They'd seen Louis Slotin sacrifice himself to save them. When the upper beryllium hemisphere had dropped, Slotin could have run. He could have left the room immediately, put distance between himself and the critical core, reduced his dose significantly. Instead, he'd stayed. He'd used his bare hand to separate the hemispheres, stopping the reaction in 0.9 seconds instead of the 3 to 4 seconds it would have taken if he'd fled, and the reaction had continued unchecked. That decision had saved the observers' lives. If the criticality had lasted 4 seconds, instead of 0.9 seconds, everyone in the room would have absorbed lethal doses. Slotin had known this instantly. He'd made a calculated decision. Trade his life for theirs. The math was simple. 1 death instead of 8. Schreiber never performed another criticality experiment. He transferred to theoretical physics research. He couldn't work with fissile materials anymore. Every time he saw plutonium, he saw Louis Slotin's face. The calm expression, the deliberate movement of his hand, the acceptance of death. Alvin Graves continued working with radiation, but he never used hands-on techniques again. Remote handling tools only, maximum shielding. He became obsessed with safety protocols. He wrote 14 papers on radiation protection. He designed new containment systems. He trained hundreds of scientists on proper handling procedures. Los Alamos Command convened an immediate investigation. The Demon Corps had now killed 2 scientists in 9 months. This was unacceptable. A review board examined every criticality experiment performed since 1944. They interviewed 43 physicists. They analyzed procedures, equipment, and safety protocols. Their findings were damning. The screwdriver technique Slotin had used was inherently unsafe. It relied entirely on human dexterity. No mechanical safeties, no fail-safe mechanisms. One muscle spasm, one moment of distraction, one slip, and the core went critical. The technique had been used in 153 separate experiments over 2 years. The fact that it had only failed twice was luck, not good engineering. The review board issued new regulations effective immediately. All criticality experiments must use remote manipulation. Mechanical spacers required between reflector components. Experiments must be designed so that gravity works against criticality, not toward it. If any component fails or is dropped, the system must automatically become less critical, not more critical. The screwdriver technique was banned permanently. Anyone caught using hands-on manipulation of critical assemblies would be terminated immediately and potentially face criminal charges for reckless endangerment. But what about the Demon Core itself? The plutonium sphere had killed 2 men. Some scientists wanted it destroyed, melt it down, dilute the plutonium, make it unusable, remove the cursed object from Los Alamos. The military disagreed. Weapons-grade plutonium was expensive. The Demon Core represented approximately $1.2 million worth of refined fissile material. Destroying it was wasteful. The core wasn't cursed, it was just radioactive plutonium. The accidents had been caused by human error, not supernatural forces. Los Alamos Command decided to use the core, not for experiments, for testing. The United States was planning a series of nuclear weapons tests at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Operation Crossroads. 2 atomic bomb detonations to study the effects of nuclear weapons on naval vessels. The Demon Core would be used in one of these tests. On July 1, 1946, 41 days after killing Louis Slotin, the Demon Core was assembled into a nuclear weapon. The design was identical to the Fat Man bomb that had destroyed Nagasaki. Plutonium core surrounded by conventional explosives. When the explosives detonated, they would compress the plutonium to supercritical density. Nuclear explosion would follow. The bomb was designated Helen of Bikini by the test crew. Gallows humor. Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Helen of Bikini, the core that killed 2 scientists and would now sink a fleet. The weapon was loaded aboard a B-29 bomber on July 24, 1946. The aircraft took off from Kwajalein Atoll at 8:00 a.m. and flew to Bikini Atoll, 250 miles northwest. The target was a fleet of 95 decommissioned naval vessels anchored in Bikini Lagoon. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, aircraft carriers. ships captured from Japan and Germany, plus obsolete American vessels, all placed at various distances from ground zero to measure blast effects. At 9:00 a.m., the B-29 released Helen of Bikini from 30,000 feet. The bomb fell for 48 seconds. At 520 feet above the lagoon surface, the barometric fuse triggered. The conventional explosives detonated. The plutonium core, the demon core, was compressed to supercritical density in 0.0002 seconds. Nuclear fission began. The chain reaction Slotin and Daghlian had accidentally initiated twice now occurred deliberately, but this time there was no one to stop it, no hand to knock away the reflector. The reaction continued, building exponentially. In 0.003 seconds, approximately 2.2 pounds of the 14-pound core underwent fission. Each fissioning atom released energy. The combined energy of billions of atoms releasing simultaneously created temperatures exceeding 10 million degrees Fahrenheit. The fireball expanded at 600 miles per hour. It vaporized the surrounding air. It created a blast wave traveling at supersonic speed. The wave hit the anchored ships with overpressure exceeding 500 pounds per square inch. Steel hulls buckled, superstructures collapsed, ships were lifted completely out of the water and thrown sideways. 5 ships sank immediately. The battleship U.S. Arkansas vaporized. One moment it was there, a 26,000-ton warship. The next moment, gone, atomized, turned into expanding plasma. The aircraft carrier U.S. Saratoga capsized and sank in 7.5 hours. The submarine USS Pilotfish broke in half. 32 other ships sustained critical damage. The mushroom cloud rose to 40,000 feet. Radioactive fallout spread across 7,000 square miles of ocean. The Demon Core, which had killed Harry Daghlian with 510 rem, and Louis Slotin with 2,100 rem, now distributed approximately 100 million rem worth of radiation across the Pacific. Fish died, birds died, microscopic organisms in the water died, but unlike Daghlian and Slotin, the military considered this a success. The test provided valuable data about nuclear weapon effects on naval forces. The Pentagon used this data to redesign ship armor and develop radiation shielding. The Demon Core had finally served its intended purpose, not killing scientists in laboratory accidents, but obliterating military targets in controlled tests. Nothing physical remained of the core. The nuclear detonation had transmuted the plutonium. Fission had split the atoms into lighter elements: barium, krypton, strontium, cesium. The Demon Core no longer existed as a discrete object. It had been dispersed as radioactive isotopes across the Pacific Ocean and upper atmosphere. But the legacy remained. 2 dead scientists, 8 survivors traumatized, safety protocols rewritten. The entire field of criticality safety had been revolutionized by these accidents. Modern nuclear facilities use multiple layers of protection that trace their origins directly to the Demon Core incidents. Medical documentation. That's the real story of the Demon Core. Not a cursed object, not supernatural evil, just 14 pounds of plutonium and the scientists who underestimated it. They tickled the dragon's tail. The dragon killed them. And from their deaths, we learn to respect the dragon. If this story showed you the real price of nuclear science, hit that like button. Subscribe for more true stories from history's most dangerous experiments. Turn on notifications. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thanks for watching.